Hello, everyone, and welcome tonight. It's not the best of circumstances, but it's the best I can do. It's June 9th, 2024, and my name is Glenn Rawson. Welcome to our devotional. Tonight, I'm in Kansas City, Missouri, so welcome. I appreciate you joining me. Right now, I am on tour with a group of wonderful people. We just met them this morning and this afternoon, and we are now on the western leg of the trail tour. We had a group that we brought out from Salt Lake, and we came all the way from Salt Lake here to Kansas City, picked up another group, and now we're going to go back along the Pioneer Trail. And tonight, I'm going to be talking about that trail and some of the little-known stories that took place along our route along this trail. Now, this trail tour that I'm going to tell you about tonight, we're going to do this tour again in September, Dennis Lyman and myself. So if you're interested in coming on this trail tour after you hear this tonight, these are some of the places we've been, then go to historyofthesaints.org or Southwest Adventure Tours out of Cedar City, Utah. All right, first story for tonight. As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. Happiness is a choice, not a chance, not something that happens. It's under our control. And I can't think of a better way to illustrate how we can choose happiness than by this story. Louisa Barnes Pratt lived in Illinois in 1846. Her husband, Addison, had been called to serve as a missionary in the South Pacific, leaving her to fend for herself in Nauvoo with 3 little children. When the call came in the spring of 1846 to leave Nauvoo and go over the Rocky Mountains, Louisa, she went to one of the leaders. I asked him, she said, if he could divine the reason why those who had sent my husband to the ends of the earth did not call to inquire whether I could prepare myself for such a perilous journey, or if I wished to go or stay. His reply, and this is classic, Sister Pratt, they, meaning the church leaders, expect you to be smart enough to go yourself without help and even to assist others. End of quote. Well, what happens next shows you the spirit of a most remarkable woman. She wrote, quote, the remark awakened in me a spirit of self-reliance. Well, I will show them what I can do. And she did. I nerved up my heart, she said, and put all my energies to the test to get ready, determined to follow the church come life or death. End of quote. And death was nearly the outcome before she was through. As they crossed the mud of Iowa, she wrote, quote, yesterday we traveled the most intolerable roads. And yet, after a day or two, Louisa chose not to look at the mud. She wrote in her diary the next day, I begin now to admire the country, such a beautiful rolling prairie. You can almost see in her diary the conscious will to be of good cheer, not a pickle sucker. And when she was deep into the wilderness, she wrote, quote, it comes suddenly to my mind how far I am going from home and parents and every relative I have in the world. But the Lord has called us and appointed us a place where we can live in peace and be free. End of quote. Eventually, Louisa and her babes arrived at winter quarters on the Missouri River, and like so many others during that winter, she became deathly ill. The shaking ague fastened deathless fangs upon me, she wrote, from which there is no escape. I shook until it appeared to me my very bones were pulverized. I wept and I prayed. Her children, also ill, huddled by their mother. Her fever broke for a time, and she managed the will to hire a man to make a sod hut for her, a soddy, 10 feet by 12. When he finished, she wrote, I hung up a blanket for a door. I built a fire, drew up my rocking chair before it, and that moment felt as rich as some persons would be to be moved into a costly building. Thus, we learn to prize enjoyments by sacrifices, end of quote. Her sufferings and sacrifices continued. The sickness ebbed and flowed through the winter, and yet she never surrendered to a complaining spirit. And in the spring of 1848, she once more answered the prophetic call and set out for the Salt Lake Valley. It was hard for me, she said, to waive the dread of a never-ending journey. But once again, Louisa plucked up her spirits, and when she was 3 weeks out on the trail, she wrote of herself, "There was not a more mirthful woman in the whole company. The grandeur of nature," she said, "filled me with grateful aspirations." Look at this woman. Under the worst of conditions, and she is cheerful. As she crossed over the Rocky Mountains, she summarized her journey. "Although we've been compelled to leave Nauvoo, we did not feel like outcasts. We realized that our Heavenly Father had made a beautiful world and that He desired that His children should enjoy it." She did not look at the mud, she looked at the beauty. And then just as the company was struggling just outside Salt Lake City over one of the worst obstacles on the trail, being Big Mountain, she wrote, "I feel now as if I could go another 1,000 miles." What a woman. On August 20th, 1848, Louisa recorded, "We ascended an eminence where with the spyglass we can see the great Salt Lake in the valley of which the saints are located. Our hearts leap for joy." While some of the saints said, "This is the place," Louisa said, "This is the place." There's a difference. It is a true principle that our hearts can leap for joy only as high as we will allow them to jump. It is in our nature to seek joy. Do we know how? Next story. For those of you that have been to Nauvoo and recognize the Scoville Bakery down on Main Street, please consider this story. As mentioned, in the spring of 46, the Latter-day Saints were a people in exile. By the spring of 46, Brigham Young and the 12 are farther out across Iowa, headed towards the Missouri River. They left in a hurry, and those who were left behind had to hurry up and catch up. And among those was Lucius N. Scoville and his family. He owned the bakery, as I said, right there in Nauvoo. But now he too was preparing his family to go into the wilderness, he wrote. And then unexpectedly, under those difficult circumstances, May the 6th, 1846, Lucius Scoville received a call to go to England as a missionary. But how could he do that? How could he go to England and leave his family to make their way across 1,300 miles of wilderness? Could you do that? May 14th, Lucius crossed the river with his family and began the long trek, following the 12 towards their new home in the Rocky Mountains. He knew not where. Over the next 2 weeks, they journeyed slowly across Iowa. Latter-day Saint refugees scattered out in all directions for as far as the eye could see. And then, May 30th, 1846, a day long to be remembered, 3 men came into the Scoville camp just at breakfast. They were going back to Nauvoo. When Lucius learned that, he felt that familiar pull, tug, push, call it whatever you want, that he knew his duty. He resolved right then and there he would answer the call and go to England. He wrote, "It was a painful duty to leave my family to go into the wilderness, and I turn and go the other way." Nonetheless, Lucius was determined to fill that mission, quote, "if it cost me all I had on this earth," end of quote. That is the law of consecration. Lucius took leave of his family without purse or scrip and undertook a journey of some 6,000 miles to England, while his wife and children followed the brethren in faith to the west. Of that day of parting, Lucius wrote, "Never since I have been in this church have I seen anything in comparison to this trial. To think of leaving my wife and children to go into the wilderness and going to a far country, but I left them, bidding them Godspeed. By this time, I was completely overcome by my feelings and could not keep from bursting into a flood of tears. And thus I left them and started on my mission for England." The Lord said, "Let every man learn his duty and act in the office in which he is appointed." Just like this, we were on that trail across Iowa. This story takes place in winter quarters. And if you come with me on this tour, I'll take you to where this happened. On June 27th, 1844, the prophet Joseph Smith was murdered by a mob in Carthage, Illinois. That heinous act dissolved the first presidency of the church. Shortly after that, August 8, 1844, the church voted unanimously to follow the quorum of the 12 apostles, of which Brother Brigham was the leader of the 12. But all along, from the very beginning, Brother Brigham knew that the first presidency had to be reorganized. But when he brought the subject up with members of the 12, there were those in the 12 who felt it was unnecessary, that the apostles were enough. After all, as a combined body, they held all the keys and authority of the first presidency. And you know, as well as I do, section 107, verse 27, that any decision that quorum makes has to be unanimous, or it's not a binding decision. From 1844 through 1847, Brigham broached the subject of the first presidency gently with his brethren, trying to persuade them. Even coming back from the Salt Lake Valley, back to winter quarters in late 47, he still brought it up. But again, there were still apostles who opposed the idea of reforming the first presidency. In December 1847, right there at Canesville, Iowa, they decided to hold a conference. It was quickly realized that there wasn't a building sufficient to hold all the members of the church there in Iowa. The conference was dismissed, and 100 men under the direction of Bishop Henry Miller, and his second great-grandson is on this tour with me right now. It's really cool, Riley Moffett. They were called to build a new tabernacle that would accommodate those members. Well, Bishop Miller and the rest went to work, and President Young and the quorum of the 12, while that labor was going on, traveled out east of Canesville about 10 miles to Hyde Park, Iowa. That's where Orson Hyde had a home and a farm. They enjoyed a nice dinner. And in the evening, that night, they held a council meeting. And once again, the subject of reorganizing the first presidency came up. And it was discussed. And as before, some were in favor, others were opposed. There was disagreement that night, but done agreeably. Peace, harmony, and love prevailed among the brethren, when all of a sudden, a voice seemed to come from above and spoke to the apostles. Quote, "Let my servant Brigham step forth and receive the full power and presiding priesthood in my church and kingdom." End of quote. Orson Hyde was there. He said that he looked up, but there was no one there. He further described the effect of that heavenly voice on those assembled men. Quote, "Every latent feeling was aroused and every heart was melted. This was the voice of the Almighty unto us. We knew and realized that we had heard the testimony of God. We did hear and feel the voice from heaven. We were filled with the power of God. End of quote. As they sat contemplating what had just happened, there came the sound of pounding feet and urgent knocking at the door. When they opened up the door, the neighbors were there. "What was that?" they said. "We heard what sounded like thunder." And one of the apostles said, "The Lord has only whispered to us a little. The voice of God has reached the earth. He's probably not very far off." The neighbors quietly backed away and went home. And again, the apostles sat in contemplative silence. And then, on an impulse, a prompting, Orson Hyde spoke. "I move that Brigham Young be made president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and that he nominate his 2 counselors, and that they 3 form a first presidency." End of quote. And that's exactly what happened. Brigham Young nominated Heber C. Kimball and Willard Richards as his 2 counselors. Then, December 27th, 1847, before approximately 1,000 members in the newly constructed Canesville Tabernacle, it was presented to the church that a new first presidency be organized. The proposal was unanimously approved, and once again, the quorum of the 3 presiding high priests was established. There is something special about standing on the ground where the precedent of the first presidency was established. Next story. And again, come with me, and I'll take you where this happened. The entire county was on the verge of civil war. 2 of the foremost leaders of the enemy had been captured and locked in jail. Rumors that the enemy's force, an army as it were, would soon attack and slaughter the citizens for arresting those leaders, created a palpable terror throughout the whole area. Among them was Amanda Benton Smith. She described how, in the midst of this tribulation, quote, that she had been living in almost constant terror for years and never knew from day to day and hardly from one hour to another what dreadful catastrophe would happen. Then word reached Amanda that an armed force of the enemy was collected on the prairie just outside their town, and that they would come sweeping in, rescue their leaders, and burn the town to the ground. Amanda believed that they would destroy the town, her home, and everything and everyone in it. She went on to describe, quote, "My neighbors began to make preparations to leave their homes with their families, and soon that part of town where I lived was entirely deserted but myself." Before long, Amanda heard gunshots, and she was filled with fear for that moment. She was powerless to move with the terror. Then word reached her that the 2 enemy leaders had been gunned down. The panic. She gathered her children, went to find her husband, who had been tasked with guarding the city against this dread enemy. She said he was full of trouble and worry over the terrible ending to the prisoners, and did not have many comforting words for his wife and children. He told them to get out of town and go find the house of a friend and stay there out in the country. Amanda goes on to describe the terrible ordeal of running from the town in the middle of the night, taking flight without time to feed her 6 children, carrying her baby, running across the prairie, fording a cold stream in the darkness, and then walking until nearly exhaustion to find safety. Her children becoming so tired that she had to drive them in running from the enemy. She finally reached a deserted house, took shelter, and wasn't there long before the house was suddenly full of refugees running from this terrible enemy and the revenge that they were going to take. It is telling when Amanda says the people were frightened and believed all the stories they heard. And surely there never was a more exciting time, she said. She's correct. It is precisely because of false stories published and believed that this conflict existed in the first place. For you see, the enemy that Amanda Benton Smith so feared and ran in terror from, they were the Latter-day Saints living in Nauvoo, Illinois. Amanda Benton Smith lived in Carthage, where the two enemy leaders, Joseph and Hiram Smith, were gunned down on that very night, June 27th, 1844. Yes, Amanda Benton Smith lived in terror for years of a people who never meant her a moment's harm. She fled in near panic, fearing revenge that never came and never would. My heart goes out to Amanda. She was innocent. She was the dupe of such individuals as Thomas Sharp. Her first-hand account reveals the deadly influence of hate-inspired lies and falsehoods. I believe she speaks for many innocent ones living in Hancock County in those times who were deliberately kept from the truth because they knew not where to find it. Perhaps it is well, again, to be reminded to be careful when popular opinion tells you to hate someone. Let's take a break. How are you? I hope you are well. And I hope someday you can come with me on one of these tours and feel the spirit of these places. I wanted to tell you again, if any of you want these stories, they come to you free every Sunday. All you have to do is sign up for the free stories, and I will send them to you, along with produced videos. I also wanted to ask you a favor. If you know of inspiring stories like the ones I'm telling you that come from your ancestors, will you send them to me? Send them to Glenn at glennrawsonstories.com or to support at glennrawsonstories.com. I would love these stories about your ancestors. And also, one more time, just to remind you, in July, about a month from now, I will be leaving with Dennis Lyman on the Old West and Cowboy Tour. If you ever want to get a feel for the settlement of the Old West and the legends and lore of the Old West cowboy, come with us. It'll be a lot of fun. Again, on this tour, I'm going to take this wonderful group of people with me right to this spot. One cold February day, Wandle Mace and others came down to the riverbank and discovered a group of people stranded on the west bank of the Mississippi. They were exiles, refugees, running for their lives. They had to get out of the state as soon as possible. And the only way out was across that river. But the river was flowing with large chunks of ice. And any attempt at crossing that river would be just simply too dangerous. They could not cross, Wandle said, and we couldn't reach them. The weather was bitterly cold, and the company across the river was stranded along the bank, stretched out, camped in the snow. They'd stuck poles in the ground and stuck up a sheet to shield them from the wind, but it was poor protection. The wind howled around. Little children huddled around the fire, trying to stay warm, but standing so close to the fire that they were burned while the wind whipped away the heat of the fire. Wandle and his friends climbed the bluffs behind them, alerted the townspeople, and they, in turn, the townspeople, called a meeting. What are we going to do? The purpose was to relieve the pressing wants of those people. The refugees were out of provisions, poorly clad, some were barefoot, and the citizens responded in mass, donated liberally, the merchants actually vying with each other as to who could be the most generous. And soon they had compiled everything. A canoe loaded with flour, pork, coffee, sugar, boots, shoes, clothing, everything that these outcasts needed to survive. But now, how are we going to get it across the river? They loaded up a canoe, but they had to get it to the other side, a mile away across that river. They called for volunteers, someone who would take the canoe. It was dangerous. No one volunteered. They tried again, and finally, one man stepped forward, only one, and volunteered. His name was John Hawley. John Hawley stepped into the canoe. It was towed upstream a little bit of a distance, and John Hawley launched the canoe into the mighty Mississippi. As the group stood on the bank and watched, Wandel described sometimes it seemed he would be swamped and all would be lost. But Hawley was calm and determined and fought his way, threading through the running ice. Many a word of cheer was shouted to him. Many a silent and earnest prayer ascended to heaven in his behalf. The Lord heard those prayers and strengthened Hawley. And after much hard labor, he landed the canoe safely near the camp. Wandel Mace characterized the event thus, quote, "It was a perilous undertaking, and no other than a brave man would have volunteered his services," end of quote. John Hawley and Wandel Mace were two of many in Quincy, Illinois, in the winter of 1839 that served and sacrificed to save a hated people called Mormons, driven from their homes by the extermination order of Missouri Governor Lilburn W. Boggs. And by the way, John Hawley couldn't swim. We were here this afternoon, here in Jackson County, where this story actually has meaning. Isaiah spoke often and eloquently about Zion that would be established in the last days. Prophets before him and after looked forward to Zion and rejoiced in the knowledge of it. Among those prophets, Ether, the Book of Mormon, prophesied that in the last days, quote, "a new Jerusalem shall be built upon this land unto the remnant of the seed of Joseph," Ether 13:6. And it was on April 5th, 1829, when a revelation commanded Oliver Cowdery, quote, "seek to bring forth and establish the cause of Zion." That command would be echoed again and again. Joseph Smith would be charged and inspired by the Almighty to, quote, "move the cause of Zion in mighty power for good." I wonder sometimes if we really grasp what Zion meant to the early church and what it means in its full fruition to the Almighty. Well, because of these revelations about Zion, the excitement of the saints to learn more about what Zion was and where it would be and how it would grow, well, that excitement mounted. It was to be, Joseph Smith taught, both a people, a place, and a condition of heart. Enoch built the first city of Zion. This group with me, I'm going to take them to where that actually started. And Enoch's people were a people of one heart and one mind and dwelt in righteousness. And then in time, as you know, Enoch's city was taken up to heaven, and the Lord promised that that city of Zion would come back again and greet the Zion, the new Jerusalem, built upon the earth in the last days. Joseph and the saints knew this city was going to be built. that they were the ones to lay the foundation of it. But where was that city going to start? Can you imagine the sense of honor and purpose that infused those first saints to be charged with fulfilling Isaiah's prophecy of establishing the perfect society of Enoch once more? They soon learned that as time marched forward, Zion would be the only people on earth not at war one with another. Zion would be a place of refuge and safety leading up to the Lord's second coming. Everything depended on Zion. It's all they could think about. Anticipation mounted, and then they learned that it was somewhere on the western frontier. On June 6th, 1831, a number of people were called to go from Kirtland, Ohio to Missouri. And there the Lord promised that he would reveal the location of Zion. Section 52, verse 5. July 20th, 1831, right here in Jackson County, Missouri, Joseph and his friends stood near Independence, and the Lord revealed, quote, "This is the land of promise, and the place for the city of Zion," section 57, verse 2. "And the place which is now called Independence is the center place, and a spot for the temple is lying westward upon a lot which is not far from the courthouse," section 57, verse 3. On August 2nd, 1831, the land of Zion was dedicated and the work began. And then on August 3rd, 1831, the prophet Joseph climbed a hill, marked the spot, and dedicated the site for the building of that great latter-day millennial temple. And then came the practical command of the Almighty, quote, "Behold, it is wisdom that the land should be purchased by the saints, that they might obtain it for an everlasting inheritance." Section 57, verses 4 and 5. Subsequently, they began to purchase Zion with donated monies. In the first year, 1831, Bishop Edward Partridge expended about $1,200 in buying tracts of land here in Jackson County upon which to settle the saints and begin to build their city of hope. I said, donated money. Who was the first principal donor? Who was the man that laid at the feet of the bishop the monies to buy the foundations of Zion? $1,200 in 1831. Martin Harris, the same man who paid for the Book of Mormon. This is a story not very many people know, and we were there this afternoon. You know that December 1st, 1839, Joseph Smith and 5 other Latter-day Saint prisoners were locked in Liberty Jail. They were there awaiting trial. In the meantime, their attorneys produced a writ of habeas corpus, which demanded that they have a hearing. So in January of 1839, Joseph Smith and the other prisoners came to the courthouse in Liberty. I took my people there this afternoon. And there at the courthouse was a hearing to determine whether or not to release Joseph Smith and the Mormon prisoners. Now, a group of men, close to 100, came across the river from Jackson County. They'd heard about this hearing, and they did not want Joseph Smith and the Mormons released. They hated him. They came angry and itching for a fight. So you can imagine, They packed into a second-story courthouse room. Judge Joel Turnham opened the proceedings. One of the attorneys representing the Latter-day Saints was a fellow named Peter Burnett, a young newspaperman and attorney. He stood up and gave the introductory remarks. As the hearing proceeded, the prosecuting attorneys gave their case why Joseph and the prisoners should not be released, and Sidney Rigdon had been carried into the room on a stretcher. He was very sick. He sat up on the stretcher and eloquently pleaded his case why he should be released. And Sidney was let go. But what about the other 5? And now comes this tense moment. The men in the room, the men from Jackson County, were foaming at the mouth, gnashing their teeth, threatening and angry, and looking like at any moment they were going to storm the stand, grab Joseph and the other prisoners, haul them outside, and lynch them. Alexander Donovan, Joseph Smith's attorney, stood up to begin the closing arguments in defense of the Mormon prisoners. Peter Burnett looked around the room and saw the angry faces and feared that there would be an imminent attack. He described the maddened crowd which foamed and gnashed their teeth, wildly threatening in very close quarters. The tensions mounted, and as they did, Burnett looked up at Donovan, slipped his hand down below, and grabbed the butt of his pistol, determined, as he would later write, to, quote, spend his life, if necessary, to protect the life of the prophet. And then Burnett looked up at Donovan and he said, quote, Donovan, let yourself out, my good fellow, and I will kill the first man that attacks you, end of quote. And Donovan began. And Burnett said that indeed his partner did let himself out, giving one of the most eloquent speeches he had ever heard in defense of the prophet. And all the while, Burnett sat there with his hand on his pistol, promising to do, ready to do exactly what he had promised to do. He would later write that he and Donovan were willing to sell our lives to protect our clients. Well, in the end, Judge Turnham freed Sidney Rigdon, let him go at night so that he wouldn't be mobbed, returned the other prisoners to the jail, and Joseph and the others would not get out for another 3 months. Eventually, they would be returned safely to the jail and eventually safely to their family. And by the way, you might find it interesting. Peter Burnett eventually went west. He served on the Supreme Courts of Oregon and California, wrote the Constitution for the state of Oregon, and became California's first territorial governor. Not everyone in Missouri hated us in 1838-39. There were some honorable men. Donovan and Burnett were 2 of them. It's fun to stand where these things actually occurred. My friends, I love church history. It's like scripture to me. It fills my soul. It inspires me. There's so much good. Don't be afraid of your history. Let it inspire and affirm your faith. Good night, and God bless.